Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the Normal and Heroic raid guide for Twin Ogron. And this fight is very simple. The basic idea here is to keep the bosses near one another as much as possible, while DPSing them down simultaneously. They do share health, and avoiding the 6 major abilities that they use, 3 per boss. The first ability to discuss is Fierce Disposition. And this is a buff that both Ogron will have throughout the entire fight, and it increases in potency based on the distance apart that the two Ogron are standing. So if they're stacked on top of one another, there's basically zero benefit from the buff to the enemies. But the further apart you pull them, the more benefit they gain from it. They get both attack speed as well as casting speed or haste, so that their abilities occur faster and they do more damage to the tank. It does not increase the damage output from their raid-wide abilities. Those don't hit any harder, but they are cast faster and used quickly such that it's more difficult to avoid. And this is important for some of the abilities in particular. So with that, you can look at the buff at any given time, just mouse over it to see the value. And it also has color changing effect. So the further apart they are, and the higher damage the value is becoming, the closer to red color it will become. For that reason, it's generally advisable to keep the enemies stacked on top of one another as much as possible, except for one particular portion of the fight, in which case you have to keep them apart, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that's the basic mechanic for Fierce Disposition. Generally speaking, it's not a problem at all. It doesn't even come into play for most of the fight. Now, while there are technically 7 abilities from the bosses on this fight, only 6 of them can you avoid in any way. 3 from each boss, so we'll start with Phemos. You can see there that he has abilities that he'll use based on his energy level. So Whirlwind is the first ability you'll see, which is at 33 energy. And this will cause him to spin around in a crazy whirl, just as you see on the right side of the screen. And while he's spinning, he is mobile, so he will need to be tanked by the Phemos tank during this period. Ideally, what you need to do is move him out of the raid just before this occurs, so that your raid does not need to move out for the whirlwind. Instead, it's just the one tank player. And probably would also help to have one healer move out with the tank, so that that tank can get healing during the period. The second ability is Enfeebling Roar at 66 energy. This is a very important ability to manage properly, and basically it's kind of an interesting mechanic. It will do a small radius shout about 20 yards around Phemos, and when he completes it, it will debuff any players within that 20-yard radius with the Enfeebling Shout debuff. However, the effectiveness of this debuff is shared and split among all the players affected. So if one player is hit, say the tank is by himself for some reason, that player will receive the full effectiveness, which is 300% damage taken for 300 seconds. However, if 2 people are splitting this debuff, it will be half of that for each player. So 150% damage taken for 150 seconds. And this goes on down the line based on the number of players you have. So it's a pretty interesting mechanic, but the basic idea behind it is that you need to stack everyone up underneath the boss when this is about to be cast. So it's really important you watch the energy levels or your boss timers, if you're using those, to make sure that you have the majority of your raid, if not the entire raid, stacked up for it. If you do so, then most of the time it's going to be around 20% damage taken for everyone and for about 20 seconds, depending on your raid count and all that stuff. So it's a pretty minor ability once you do it properly. And there you can see just about everyone in the raid got hit by it. And I guess I lied. It's 30. It was around 30 seconds for us there. But it's still much more manageable in that situation. Lastly, for Phemos, we have Quake and Blaze, and this is the 2-for-1 ability. Quake is unavoidable. It's just pulsing raid-wide damage. Blaze is the most important, and he will throw both of his weapons toward the center of the room at the edges of the larger inner circle, so you can see them in the top left of the screen. And once these weapons are activated, they will start to spew gouts of fire in sort of 3 angles from the weapons. However, they don't go in straight lines, they start to curve as they path around. So the positioning for the boss in general is to avoid half of the fire for the entire raid. By staying away from the center of the room and keeping to one side, you can stand sort of behind the existing fire lines and only have to dodge the fire from one of the 2 weapons that he throws. So that's the easiest way to mitigate a lot of potential damage on the raid, is keeping the boss on the side here behind the weapons. Now it's also worth noting that the fire damage from getting hit by the fire is extremely high. It stacks up very quickly, even on lower difficulties. So that players that receive probably more than 3 or 4 stacks will definitely want to use a personal cooldown of some kind, because the dot itself is a short duration, but as I said, it's very high damage per second for that period. More importantly than that, though, is as long as you're watching your timers, you should allow your raid to move, even out of range of the bosses temporarily, to dodge fire lines, because there are always gaps in where the fire comes in, so you can arguably easily dodge it as long as you're just watching for where those are positioned. Now, Pol, on the other hand, has much easier abilities to deal with, generally speaking. So he's not quite as dangerous, but because the enemies share health in this difficulty, it doesn't really matter because you're going to have to deal with them all anyway. So shield charge at 33 energy is first, and this is a very basic ability. He will randomly select a player outside of melee range, if there are any, and charge toward them after a few seconds of preparing the charge. So the best thing to do is just watch, again, your energy levels or your boss mods, see when that's about to occur, and have the raid members that are getting charged move to the side. Now, this can be always forced to go the same direction by having ranged DPS stacking at one particular point outside of melee range. And that is a strategy we later implemented, and you don't see it in this video here. But essentially, if you just have all your range stacked in one position, just a few yards out of melee range, he will always charge toward that position. So you'll know where it's going, and you can just dodge out of the way. At 66 energy, Interrupting Shout is just as it sounds. He will start to cast a shout, and when it completes, if you're casting an ability yourself, you'll be interrupted and silenced for about 6 seconds, I believe. So just communicate in your voice chat when that's about to occur, and it's pretty easy. Finally, at 100 energy is Pulverize. This is actually a series of casts, 3 in a row, each with differing effects somewhat. So the first cast to Pulverize, which you want to obviously plan for originally, is a small raid-wide hit to everyone, but this damage then pulses in about 3 yards radius from every player to anyone else nearby. So when Pulverize is about to hit initially, the best thing to do is simply spread your raid very slightly. Again, it's only 3 yards, so you don't need to spread very much. Just make sure people are not completely stacked up, because the damage will spread pretty quickly. That said, it's not a big deal if a few people do spread that damage. It's pretty minor overall, but it's a good idea to practice that as intended. The second, Pulverize, is just a couple minor rocks that will fall from the ceiling, do a little bit of damage. You cannot avoid them. And then the final hit from Pulverize is one giant rock that should be avoided. It does very heavy damage, but it dissipates based on the distance away from the center that you get. So ideally, everyone should move at least 15 or 20 yards away from that giant rock when it's about to land. There you can see it coming down now. And you won't take lethal damage as long as you're not super low on health. So that's pretty much it. Pol's abilities, like I said, are very simple. In a sense, he's really there just to be an annoyance, but the fight itself really revolves around Phemos and dealing with his abilities. So the last thing to discuss is positioning of both the raid and the bosses, and the timing of movement for the bosses. So the simplest thing to do is you do not need tank swap on this difficulty. So you just have your tanks pick an appropriate target, generally based on the movement capabilities of each tank. So the tank with higher movement ability should be on Phemos. So in this case, we're using our monk for that, and the other tank should be on Pol. Phemos has a potential to do slightly higher burst damage, so be aware of that for your healers in particular, but otherwise it's mostly about the movement. As already discussed, the only time you need to move the bosses apart is just before Phemos reaches 33 energy and casts Whirlwind. Now, because you want to make sure you're in position out of the raid before Whirlwind begins, because it does do a lot of damage, we found it was best for our Phemos tank to start moving out around 20 energy or so. Earlier is better than later. That's the rule of thumb here. Because the enemies share health pool, you're only losing a little bit of cleave damage onto Phemos when your raid is targeting Pol anyway, while Phemos is out of range. So it's better to lose 5% energy worth of cleave damage than to accidentally have the raid get whirlwinded. Also, because of the timing of the whirlwind following the quake and blaze from the weapons, your tank is going to have to move into whirlwind position out of the raid during those blaze fire gout hits. So it's best, again, to move early for the tank so that he or she can dodge the fire waves slowly but surely as they make their way over, rather than trying to rush through and gathering a ton of stacks of fire damage. Other than that, I already discussed your raid can stack outside of melee range, preferably on the other side of Pol, away from where the whirlwind position is happening, and this will allow the raid to always know where the charge ability is coming from Pol, and dodge that accordingly. And that's about it. Otherwise, your raid can basically stay stacked up, except for when the first hit of pulverize is coming down, as already discussed. But generally speaking, you just stay on the side of the room here, grouped up, and just manage the abilities that are coming in the next 5 or 10 seconds. So that's it. This is no Kargath difficulty, but it's a very close second in terms of simplicity. It's a very easy fight, and because all the other bosses are optional in the first area leading up to Twins, you can absolutely just go from Kargath to Twins, and I believe it would be the easiest progression in the zone. So that is normal raid guide for Twin Ogron. There's also a "the" in there somewhere, but I can't speak. So as always, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Good luck, and see you next time.